I spent 20 years clawing my way up, from an orphan to a billionaire, just to come back here and teach you one lesson. The Bronx, New York. A January night, the temperature outside had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit or -10 degrees Celsius. Icy winds howled through the cracked frames of the old windows in the dilapidated red brick apartment building, producing eerie sounds like distant wailing cries. Inside apartment 4B, Elena Cruz was curled up on a threadbare sofa, its stuffing spilling out through torn fabric. At 30 years old, the woman looked far older than her actual age, her cheeks hollow from chronic hunger. She wore an oversized ash-gray hoodie brought from a thrift store, her hands clutching a cup of hot water, the only source of warmth she had at the moment, since the radiator in the corner of the room had completely died 2 days earlier. Elena had just returned from a 12-hour shift cleaning an office building in Manhattan, her hands red and cracked from harsh chemical detergents. Bang! The apartment door flew open without a single knock. Elena jolted in shock, the water in the cup sloshing onto her hand, scalding hot. A blast of freezing air rushed in, followed by an even more overpowering and unpleasant scent, expensive perfume mixed with the smoky stench of cigars. Marco Vega walked in. At 50 years old, Marco looked well-fed and imposing in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, completely out of place beneath the mold-stained ceiling of this apartment. In his hand dangled a key ring bearing the Porsche Shield logo. He was of Latin descent like Elena, but from the way his hair was slicked back with gel to the contempt in his eyes, he radiated a ruthless rejection of his own origins. He didn't close the door. He wanted the cold to pour in. Marco raised his hand to pinch his nose, grimacing as if he had just stepped into a landfill. Jesus Christ, what is that smell? The smell of failure or the cheap food you people eat? Elena set the cup down and stood up, her voice trembling but controlled. Mr. Vega, you can't just enter my apartment like this, and the radiator is broken. I've called you 3 times. Shut up, Marco shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. He stepped forward and nudged the leg of the wobbly table with the toe of his polished leather shoe. I'm not here to listen to you whine about a damn dead heater. I'm here to tell you the new rules. He pulled a sheet of paper from his suit pocket and tossed it onto the dusty table. Starting tomorrow, the rent for this garbage apartment is $3,000 a month. No more $1,500. Elena's eyes widened, her breath forming white clouds in the icy room. Are you insane? $3,000? That's luxury apartment pricing in Queens. My lease is still valid, and New York state law doesn't allow... Marco sneered and stepped closer, blowing alcohol-soaked breath into her face. The law. Look at me. Who do I look like? I own this building. I'm selling this shithole to Vanguard Group so they can build luxury condos. I need sewer rats like you gone immediately so the place is clean. He pointed at the door. You have 2 options, old hen. 1, pay $3,000 tomorrow morning. 2, get the hell out. Don't threaten me with the law. I've got a whole team of lawyers who can grind you into dust. With that, Marco turned and walked out, his heels pounding threateningly against the creaking wooden floor. He left the door wide open, the snowstorm wind roaring in, blowing the rent increase notice off the table and onto the freezing floor at Elena's feet. She stood there in silence, her dark eyes following his figure as he climbed into the Porsche Cayenne parked on the street below. Her silence was not acceptance. It was the calm before the storm. 9 o'clock the next morning. The cold from the previous night's snowstorm still clung to the thick layers of ice coating the window panes. Inside apartment 4B, Elena sat upright at the crooked wooden table. In front of her was not a packed suitcase, as Marco had expected, but a stack of cash. It was a pitiful sight in the eyes of any wealthy person. Small denominations, $5, $10, $20, even rolls of 25-cent coins, quarters, stacked together. All of it wrinkled, stained with sweat and grease, the distinctive smell of cash that had passed through the hands of manual laborers at the very bottom of society. Elena had gathered exactly $1,500. The door flew open again. This time, Marco Vega wasn't alone. He brought with him two large men wearing private security uniforms. He walked in with a triumphant expression, expecting to see an empty apartment. But when he saw Elena still sitting there, the smile vanished from his face. "You're still not gone?" Marco hissed, pulling off his expensive leather gloves and tossing them onto the sofa. Elena didn't stand up. Calmly, she pushed the crumpled stack of cash toward him. She lifted her gaze, her eyes unusually firm, completely at odds with her worn appearance, and spoke. "This is this month's rent, a full $1,500. According to Section 4, Clause 2 of the lease agreement we signed, this rate is fixed until June of next year. You do not have the right to unilaterally change the contract, and you certainly do not have the right to raise the rent by more than 5% without 90 days' notice." What stunned Marco was not her knowledge of the law, but her tone. Elena wasn't speaking in broken English with the heavy immigrant accent he was used to hearing in this neighborhood. She spoke in clear, precise American English, refined and sharp, like a CNN news broadcast. A flicker of confusion crossed Marco's eyes before arrogance quickly took over. He looked at the pile of small bills on the table as if it were a pile of diseased trash. "You're teaching me the law?" Marco laughed loudly, the sound shrill and grating. He stepped forward, swung his thick arm, and slapped the table. Crash! The entire stack of bills and rolls of coins scattered across the floor. $1 bills fluttered down like leaves in a cold wind. Marco jabbed his gold-ringed index finger inches from Elena's face, growling, "Listen carefully, you stupid woman. This is America. In this country, the law isn't in books. The law is in the hands of people with money. I can buy a dozen lawyers to turn you into an illegal squatter. I don't need your filthy, stinking cash. I need you gone so I can make millions. Understand?" He turned to the two guards and gave a cruel nod. "She won't leave. Help her pack." The two massive security guards, muscles bulging beneath their black uniforms, stormed into the apartment like predators released from their chains. They weren't there to help pack, they were there to destroy. There were no cardboard boxes, no packing tape, and certainly no basic respect for someone else's property. One guard grabbed all of Elena's clothes hanging on the rack, worn sweaters and janitor uniforms, crumpled them into a chaotic bundle, and shoved it under his arm. The other marched to the bed, yanked off the bedsheet, and dragged the thin mattress toward the front door. In the kitchen, dishes clattered violently as they swept everything off the shelves into a black trash bag. Elena rushed forward, spreading her arms to block the doorway, her voice hardening as she tried to rise above the chaos. "Stop right now. You're committing a crime. In New York, only city marshals are authorized to carry out an eviction after a court order. What you're doing is called self-help eviction, and it is a felony." She turned to stare directly at Marco, who leaned casually against the doorframe, lighting a cigar, smoke drifting lazily through the frozen air. "Mr. Vega, the temperature outside is -10 degrees Celsius. The law strictly forbids forcing tenants onto the street in dangerous weather conditions like this. You're playing with fire." Marco took a long drag, blew smoke into Elena's face, and sneered. "I'm not playing with fire. I'm burning trash. I told you already, I'm the owner here. I don't need to wait for some old judges to stamp a useless piece of paper. I want you gone, you're gone." He snapped his fingers at the guards. "Don't listen to this crazy woman. Throw everything onto the sidewalk. If she doesn't move, throw her out too."
Following the order, one guard violently shoved Elena into the corner wall. He carried the mattress past her, crushing scattered coins under his boots. The sound of furniture being hurled down the stairwell echoed brutally through the building. In just 15 minutes, apartment 4B, once modest but orderly, was reduced to an empty, frozen cavern. The window stood wide open, snowstorm winds rushing in, dusting the bare wooden floor with white frost. Elena stood up and brushed off her hoodie. She didn't resist anymore. She looked at Marco one last time, her eyes no longer pleading, but coldly acknowledging. He had just officially crossed the red line drawn by the law. The sidewalk scene in the Bronx now looked like a battlefield after an airstrike. The few possessions Elena had accumulated over her entire life lay scattered everywhere, soaked through on the filthy snow. A chair with a broken leg, several faded pieces of clothing strewn about, and hardcover books with their pages violently flipped by the wind, fluttering helplessly. Passers-by began to gather, pointing and whispering, their curious looks mixed with pity aimed at Elena. But the worst part was not the bone-piercing cold seeping into her skin. It was what Marco Vega did next. Instead of leaving after achieving his goal, Marco stood arrogantly on the clean, elevated concrete steps of the building. He pulled out the latest model iPhone, turned on Instagram Live, and aimed the camera toward the wreckage on the street below. "Hey everyone, look what I'm doing today," Marco shouted into the phone, his voice excited as if he were showing off a new toy. He pointed the camera straight at Elena, who stood hunched in the snowstorm, clutching a small cloth bag to her chest. "This is why you need to hustle and make money, unless you want to end up like this old hag," Marco sneered, zooming in on Elena's soaked canvas shoes as he spoke. "Look at this, cleaning out the trash to make room for the upper class. Bye-bye, you worthless poor thing." On his phone screen, streams of ha-ha emojis and heart reactions from his wealthy friends flooded in. Cruel comments like, "That's trash," and "Nice job kicking her out, Marco," scrolled nonstop. He read a few of them out loud, laughing boisterously, turning another person's misery into entertainment. Neighbors cracked open their windows to look outside. Poor working-class residents, Latin immigrant mothers holding their babies, trembled at the sight. They were furious, fists clenched, but no one dared step in. They feared Marco's power, feared retaliation, feared that tomorrow they might be the ones thrown onto the street. Marco stepped down onto the sidewalk and used the tip of his expensive leather shoe to kick away an old photo frame lying in the snow, a black and white picture of an elderly woman smiling gently. The glass shattered, the sharp crack echoing coldly. "Never come back here again, got it? Get the hell out of my sight." He spat on the ground near where Elena stood, then turned and climbed into his warm Porsche, leaving her alone in the snowstorm, drenched in humiliation before thousands of online viewers. The engine of the Porsche Cayenne roared, ripping through the frozen silence before speeding away, leaving behind trails of gray exhaust blending into the white snowfall. The curious crowd slowly dispersed, each person hurrying back to the safety of their own home, leaving the unfortunate woman alone in the biting cold. No one dared stay to help, because in this neighborhood, kindness was sometimes a dangerous luxury. Elena stood there, motionless like a statue of ice. Snow began to settle on her jet-black hair. Strangely, contrary to what Marco and the crowd expected, she didn't shed a single tear. No sobbing, no collapse, no signs of despair from someone who had just lost her home. She slowly bent down and brushed the snow off the chaotic pile of belongings. Her hands, though numb with cold, moved with precision and clear intent. She picked up a small oak wooden box that had fallen from her bag earlier, the only thing she cared about at this moment, more than clothes or money. Click! Elena flipped the box open. Inside, resting neatly on red velvet, was not jewelry or a family keepsake, but a professional Sony digital voice recorder. A tiny red LED light was still blinking steadily, indicating that REC mode was still active. She pressed stop and saved the file. The entire conversation, from the declaration that the law belongs to those with money, to the admission of eviction without a court order, to the public humiliation, had all been captured in crystal clear, high-resolution audio. In New York State, the law allows secret recording with the consent of only one party consent law. Elena knew this well. She had set this trap from the very moment Marco stepped into her apartment the day before. She needed him to openly confess his contempt for the law, and his arrogance had led him straight into it. Elena slipped the recorder into the inner pocket of her coat, closest to her heart to keep the battery warm. She lifted her head and looked in the direction where Marco's car had disappeared. Her eyes had completely changed. The fear and submissiveness of a poor janitor woman were gone. In their place was a cold, calculating, commanding gaze, the look of a true shark watching prey that had willingly put its neck into a noose. She pulled up her hoodie to hide her face, grabbed the small bag holding the crucial evidence, and walked decisively into the snowstorm. The game was only just beginning. 3 days passed after that fateful snowstorm night. In Midtown Manhattan, inside a top-tier law firm's office on the 50th floor of a skyscraper, the atmosphere was the complete opposite of the Bronx's bitter cold. The room was filled with warm sunlight, the faint scent of Italian leather from the sofa, and rich mahogany from the massive desk. Marco Vega leaned back in a leather chair, swirling a glass of 25-year-old Macallan, its amber liquid shimmering in the sunlight. Across from him sat his personal attorney, organizing a thick stack of documents. "I told you," Marco laughed loudly, his voice echoing with triumph. "No lawsuits, no trouble. Those sewer rats in the slums are scared of power, scared of money. That Elena woman is probably hiding under some bridge by now." The lawyer slid the folder toward Marco, his expression cautious yet tinged with admiration for his client's audacity. "Mr. Vega, you really have nerves of steel. That property has been fully cleared, and its valuation has skyrocketed. The buyer—" At the mention of the name Vanguard Realty, Marco's eyes lit up like headlights. It was the most secretive and powerful real estate investment fund in existence, famous for billion-dollar acquisitions with no publicly known owner, the ultimate silent partner. Selling the building to Vanguard was Marco's one-way ticket into the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. $20 million, Marco murmured, staring at the bold number on the front page of the contract, his finger caressing it like a lover. "One signature, and I'm done with New York's damn cold. Miami yachts, here I come." He pulled out his gold-plated Mont Blanc fountain pen without bothering to read the binding clauses that followed. His mind was already filled with images of poolside parties and supermodels. He believed evicting Elena had been the smartest decision of his life, clearing the title so he could hand over a clean asset to the buyer. "Sign it, Marco. Your new life is waiting," he told himself, and signed his name with a flamboyant flourish on the line marked Seller. He had no idea that this signature was not a ticket to paradise in Miami, but a death sentence for his career. He had just stepped into the iron cage that Vanguard Realty, or rather Elena Cruz, had patiently prepared. "Congratulations, millionaire," the lawyer raised his glass in a toast. Marco drained his drink, feeling the burning warmth in his throat, the taste of victory, before the nightmare began. Marco Vega's euphoria didn't last more than 48 hours. On Monday morning, he sat in his private office inside the very building he had just sold on paper, cheerfully browsing yacht listings, already comparing the latest Azimuth models. He had even placed a deposit on first-class plane tickets to Miami. Knock, knock. His secretary stepped in, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Mr. Vega, someone is here to see you. I told them you were busy, but they—" Before she could finish, a stranger in a beige trench coat, cold and professional in demeanor, slipped past her and walked straight into the office. In his hand was a thick yellow envelope stamped in red. "Marco Vega?" the man asked flatly. "Who the hell are you? Who let you in here?" Marco jumped to his feet, shouting. The man didn't flinch. He tossed the envelope onto the polished wooden desk with a dull thud. "You have been served. Have a nice day." He turned and left as quickly as he had arrived. He was a professional process server, the nightmare of America's shadowy business world. Fuming, Marco grabbed the envelope, ready to tear it apart, assuming it was another housing court notice from Elena demanding relocation damages. But when he saw the seal on the first page, his hands began to shake violently. This wasn't the Bronx housing court. It was the United States District Court. He read the bold heading, Summons and Complaint. His vision blurred as he scanned down to the plaintiff section. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he had misread it. It didn't say Elena Cruz. The black letters stared back at him. Vanguard Realty Holdings, LLC. "What the hell is this?" Marco screamed, cold sweat soaking his back. "Why is Vanguard suing me? I just sold them the building." He frantically flipped through the charges. Count 1, breach of the good faith clause in the purchase agreement. Count 2, financial fraud and concealment of the property's legal status. Count 3, civil rights violations and violations of the Fair Housing Act. Below it was an emergency notice. All assets belonging to Marco Vega were subject to a temporary restraining order pending investigation. Marco collapsed into his chair. His phone rang shrilly on the desk. It was his lawyer. "Mr. Vega," the lawyer's voice was panicked, "the bank just called. Your accounts are frozen. Vanguard didn't wire the $20 million. They wired a lawsuit. We're finished. What the hell did you do to that building?" Marco's mouth fell open as the phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor. He finally realized he wasn't up against a poor janitor woman. He was being crushed by a massive force he never saw coming. 3 days later, at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, often called the Mother Court, the ultimate nightmare of white-collar criminals, the air inside the courtroom was thick, so silent that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard with every second. Marco Vega sat at the defendant's table, repeatedly adjusting the tie that felt like it was strangling his throat. Beside him was David Ross, one of Manhattan's most famous attorneys, billing $1,000 an hour. "Stay calm, Marco," Ross whispered while flipping through documents. "Vanguard Realty is just an investment fund. They're suing you to pressure you on price. We'll settle this out of court." "All rise," the court clerk announced loudly. The elderly judge entered and took his seat on the towering leather-backed bench. He struck the gavel. "This court is now in session for civil case number 14-2024, Vanguard Realty Holdings, LLC versus Marco Vega." The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. "Will the legal representative for the plaintiff, Vanguard Realty, please stand?" The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slowly opened. Time seemed to freeze. The sharp sound of high heels echoed against the marble floor. Click, click, click. What entered was not an overweight executive or an aging lawyer that Marco had imagined. It was a woman. She wore an ivory Chanel suit, exquisitely tailored to her slim yet commanding frame. Her jet-black hair, which had been soaked and tangled in the snowstorm, was now neatly pulled into a high bun, revealing a face with light makeup but razor-sharp features. Her presence radiated cold authority, like that of a reigning monarch. Behind her followed 4 elite Wall Street attorneys carrying crocodile leather briefcases, walking respectfully like royal guards escorting a queen. Marco squinted. That silhouette, it felt disturbingly familiar. His heart skipped a beat. As the woman passed the defendant's table, she paused slightly. She didn't look at Marco, but the scent of her luxury perfume, so different from the smell of bleach and detergent days earlier, hit him full in the face, triggering a terrifying memory. She sat down at the plaintiff's table and turned around. Marco's mouth fell open, his eyes bulging as if they might pop out of their sockets. He stammered, pointing with a trembling hand, You were the janitor, Elena?" David Ross turned pale, yanking Marco's hand down and hissing through clenched teeth. "Shut up, you idiot! Do you have any idea who you're pointing at? That's—" "What?" Marco shouted, forgetting he was in court. "A billionaire? But she cleaned my building. She wore ripped clothes." Elena remained silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead at the judge, not sparing Marco even a single glance. Her silence was more terrifying than 1,000 accusations. The trap had snapped. Only now did the prey realize whose jaws it was inside. David Ross leaned in close to Marco's ear, his voice shaking with sheer panic, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Mr. Vega, you're finished. Elena Cruz doesn't buy real estate the normal way. She's a shark who specializes in distressed assets. She didn't buy your building from you. Marco stared blankly, his brain going numb. That meant Elena was neither a buyer nor a tenant. Legally, she was his creditor. From the plaintiff's table, Elena stood up. She adjusted the perfectly pressed lapel of her Chanel jacket and spoke, her voice cold and surgical. "Your Honor, the defendant Marco Vega wonders why I appeared as a poor janitor for the past 6 months. The answer is simple: special due diligence." She stepped away from the table and slowly walked toward Marco, her eyes drilling into his soul. "At Vanguard Realty, we don't just invest in bricks, we invest in people. Before deciding whether to inject capital and restructure Mr. Vega's debt, I needed to know who my partner truly was without the spotlight. I needed to see how he treated the weakest people, the ones he called sewer rats." The courtroom was dead silent. Marco shrank into his chair. Elena continued, her voice even sharper. "I gave you chances. I paid the rent in full. I reminded you of the law, but you chose cruelty. You thought you were throwing a poor cleaning woman onto the street. No, Marco, you evicted your own creditor, and in doing so you committed a severe violation of the moral clause in your loan agreement." Vanguard's lead attorney stood and declared firmly, "Your Honor, due to the defendant Marco Vega's criminal conduct, namely illegal eviction, pursuant to Article 13, Section 5 of the credit agreement, Vanguard Realty hereby declares Mr. Vega's loan in default. We demand immediate repayment of principal and interest. The total amount is $50 million. $50 million. Marco felt the ground collapse beneath him. He didn't have that money. Every asset he owned was leveraged. He hadn't just lost the building, he had lost everything. He looked at Elena, the woman he had mocked, humiliated, and thrown into the snow, now standing there holding his life in her carefully manicured hand. "Objection! This is entrapment!" Marco Vega slammed his hands on the table and jumped to his feet, sweat streaming down his face, smearing his makeup. "She provoked me on purpose. She pretended to be poor to trick me into breaking the law. A contract can't be voided over a few angry words." Elena's lead attorney didn't bother arguing. He simply nodded to the court clerk. "Your Honor, permission to present evidence." The courtroom lights dimmed. 2 large screens on the walls flickered on. First came the crackling yet unmistakably clear audio from the Sony recorder, Exhibit A. Marco's arrogant voice echoed through the silent room. "This is America. The law belongs to those with money. I don't need to wait for some old judges." The elderly judge narrowed his eyes, his facial muscles tightening as he heard himself referred to as an old judge. Before Marco could explain, the screen switched to Exhibit B, the Instagram live stream. Marco's laughing face appeared on screen as Elena's belongings were thrown into the snow. Every insult toward the poor, every contemptuous gesture, and the kick that shattered the old woman's photo frame, all replayed in brutal clarity like a slow-motion documentary of cruelty. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jurors shook their heads. David Ross buried his face in his hands and slumped over the table. He knew the game was over. No lawyer could defend stupidity and malice recorded this clearly. Elena sat with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen, her face showing no satisfaction, only the cold neutrality of justice being carried out. The lights came back on. The judge stared at Marco as if he were an insect. He slammed the gavel down hard. Bang! The court finds that the defendant, Marco Vega, engaged in fraudulent conduct, harassment, and malicious illegal eviction in direct violation of the asset protection clauses of the loan agreement. He delivered the verdict. The court grants the plaintiff's request. Foreclosure judgment is ordered effective immediately. Ownership of the building and all related assets is transferred to Vanguard Realty for liquidation. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck again. Marco collapsed into his chair, ears ringing. It was over. He hadn't just lost the case, he had lost everything. Marco staggered out of the courthouse, walking like a soulless man. His expensive attorney, David Ross, had quietly slipped out the back door the moment the gavel fell, leaving his client alone to face the storm. In the world of money, when you run out of cash, you run out of friends. Marco's iPhone vibrated violently in his hand, burning hot. He trembled as he unlocked the screen. Not messages of sympathy, but a flood of red alerts from banking apps. Chase Bank, alert, your account has been frozen by court order. American Express, your platinum card has been deactivated. Bank of America, available balance $0, 0 cents. Panicking, he ran toward the VIP parking lot where his glossy Porsche Cayenne was parked, his last lifeline, his final source of pride. But the sight before him was devastating. A massive tow truck was chaining its cold steel hooks around the Porsche's wheels. A burly man in a reflective jacket slapped a bright sticker on the windshield, repossessed. "Stop! What the hell are you doing?" Marco screamed, lunging forward and grabbing the tow driver's jacket. "That's my car! I'll sue you!" The driver shoved Marco aside effortlessly and handed him a yellow notice. "Not yours anymore. The bank ordered repossession of the collateral. Step away unless you want your legs crushed." The Porsche was lifted into the air and hauled away without mercy, taking Marco Vega's dignity and ego with it. With no car and declined credit cards, Marco had to walk nearly 20 blocks back to his office. He panted heavily, sweat soaking his expensive Italian suit, now wrinkled and pathetic. When he reached his office building, the county sheriff was sealing the revolving glass doors with yellow tape. 2 security guards, the same men who had helped throw Elena's belongings into the snow, now stood with crossed arms blocking the entrance. "Move! I'm the owner here," Marco charged forward, trying to rip the tape down. One guard stopped him, voice icy. "Sorry, Mr. Vega, you no longer have any authority here. We're acting under direct orders from the new owner, Vanguard Realty. Please leave before we call 911 for trespassing." Marco stood frozen on the sidewalk. Cold wind slammed into his face. In just 60 minutes, he had gone from real estate millionaire to a true homeless man. No home, no car, no money, and no dignity. He looked around, fear creeping into every cell of his body. He realized he was standing in the exact position he had forced Elena into days earlier. But unlike Elena, he had no backup plan. And, most importantly, he had no one left by his side. Marco stood dazed in front of the office building that had once belonged to him. He saw Elena step out of a sleek black Maybach parked nearby, speaking calmly with the new management team. With no pride left to cling to, Marco lunged forward, breaking through the security barrier. He collapsed to his knees in front of Elena, right there on the crowded sidewalk. "Elena, Miss Cruz, please, have mercy," Marco sobbed, tears mixing with mucus and running down his wrinkled suit. "I know I was wrong, but you can't do this to me. We're both Latin. We're from the same roots, paisanos. How can a Latina drive another Latina to absolute ruin like this?" Elena motioned for the guards to step back. She removed her sunglasses, revealing deep black eyes holding the sorrow of 2 decades. She looked down at Marco, kneeling at her feet, her voice low, calm, yet ice cold. "Paisanos, do you remember Christmas night of 2004, Marco?" Marco froze, looking up at her in confusion. Elena continued, each word hammering into his chest. "That year, there was an old woman named—" Marco's face drained of all color. A vague memory of an elderly woman begging him years ago surged back. "She died of acute pneumonia that very night in a freezing alley, her hand still clutching a photograph of her only granddaughter who was studying far away. That granddaughter was me." Elena bent down, leaning close to Marco's face. "I spent 20 years clawing my way up, from an orphan to a billionaire, just to come back here and teach you one lesson. I didn't buy your building to make a profit. I bought it to make sure there would never be a second Maria Cruz dying because of you again. This isn't business, Marco. This is karma." Marco collapsed completely. He bowed his head to the pavement, unable to speak. He finally understood that he hadn't just lost a financial battle. He was paying the price for a sin from the past. 1 month later. A street corner in the Bronx, the very place where Elena had once been thrown out. Snow was still falling, but it no longer felt as cold as the surrounding buildings had been renovated, warm light glowing from their windows. Marco Vega, now unshaven, wearing a worn coat donated by a shelter, stood shivering on the corner. In his hands was a cardboard sign with shaky letters, "Homeless and hungry, God bless." Pedestrians passed him by. Some cast him looks of contempt, the same looks he had once thrown at the poor. He lowered his head, fully absorbing the depth of his humiliation. A luxury car rolled to a stop right in front of him. The window slid down. Marco instinctively reached out with his plastic cup for spare change, then froze. It was Elena. Terrified, Marco stepped back, about to run, thinking she had come to mock him one last time. "Stop," Elena said, not harshly, but with unquestionable authority. She didn't hand him money. She handed him a neatly clipped A4 sheet of paper. "Read it," she ordered. Marco trembled as he took it. It was an employment contract. Position, security and janitor. Location, Maria Cruz Community Home, the former building owned by Marco, now renamed and converted into affordable housing. Wage, $15 an hour, minimum wage. Benefits, a small basement room with a fully functioning heater. Marco looked up, tears filling his eyes, his voice breaking. "Why? After everything I've done, why are you saving me?" Elena met his gaze. There was no hatred in her eyes now, only the compassion of someone standing on higher ground. "I could destroy you with money, Marco, but my grandmother once told me, the best revenge is not turning yourself into the same monster as your enemy, but teaching your enemy how to be human." She pointed toward the building. "Your job is to keep this place clean and safe for poor tenants, the very people you once called rats. Serve them. Learn to respect them. Don't disappoint me again." The car window rolled up. Elena's vehicle pulled away, leaving Marco standing there sobbing like a child, overwhelmed by regret and gratitude. He wiped his tears, carefully folded the contract and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He looked up at the new name on the building, Maria Cruz Community Home. Marco threw the begging sign into a trash bin. He walked toward the main entrance, straightening his worn coat. Just then, an elderly Latina woman approached, struggling with heavy grocery bags. Instead of turning away as he once would have, Marco rushed forward, opened the glass door, and bowed his head deeply, his voice trembling but sincere. "Please, let me help you, ma'am. Welcome home." The old woman smiled and thanked him. Marco smiled back, the first genuine smile he had worn in years, the smile of a man who had finally found the conscience he had lost.